Hello, this is Michael Tracy. This video is going to look at the 1988 fall season on Mount Everest. That season saw an extremely large number of commercial expeditions with inexperienced climbers, a massive storm, a stranded climber who became blind and was nearly left for dead. It had several deaths, a helicopter rescue, disputed summit, one of Rob Hall's clients. Rather than being a precursor to the 1996 season, it was exactly the opposite. Many things went right in 1988, and looking at why that was will give us some insight into the real problems with commercialization on Everest. I will cover the disputed summit of Lydia Bradey a little later in the video. For background on Lydia Bradey, you should watch the video from Adventures Gone Wrong, which I link in the description, and I am assuming you've watched that video. I will get into the analysis of whether she reached the summit, and I conclude that it is overwhelmingly likely that she did. But to understand much of the dispute about her summit, it is important to understand what happened on Everest in the fall of 1988. And this will entail debunking the myth that Rob Hall was a risk-averse guy that followed the rules. If you are a Rob Hall fan, or you really like the fairy tale that has been put together after his death, then this video is not for you. We already saw the 1996 scam with Lauren Krupp to defraud the Nepalese government of $30,000 in permit fees, which had 3 of Rob's clients actually climbing on Krupp's permit. But Rob Hall's creative solutions around restrictions of the Nepalese government started back in 1988, his very first trip to the mountain. In 1988, Rob Hall and his climbing partner Gary Ball wanted to lead an expedition to Mount Everest, despite neither of them ever having set foot on the mountain and neither having summited any 8,000-meter peak. Without a single 8,000-meter summit between either one of them, they thought it would be easy to tackle K2 in the spring and then knock off Everest in the fall of 1988. And not just as clients tagging along on someone else's expedition, but as leaders of their own teams. I won't cover their equally unsuccessful attempt on K2, but the pure arrogance of Rob Hall and Gary Ball was apparent from their early climbs. Unfortunately, arrogance and longevity are mutually exclusive among mountaineers, with both Rob Hall and Gary Ball perishing after rather short climbing careers. Both would end up dying from entirely avoidable situations of their own making. Even today, the historical revision of Rob Hall continues, with the Adventure Consultant's website claiming that Rob Hall's early climbs include a second ascent of the 7,000-meter Mount Number in the Solo region. Mount Number is not a 7,000-meter peak, coming in 42 meters short, nor was the ascent a second ascent. The Southwest Ridge route of Number was climbed by a Japanese climber and Sherpa back in 1963 and a French expedition in 1981, prior to Rob Hall climbing as a member of Peter McAnley's New Zealand team in 1982. As I will get into shortly, Everest in 1988 and many other years had the so-called crowds and the inexperienced climbers. However, these masses of inexperienced climbers were guided by people with enough common sense to get their clients off the mountain before things got out of hand. And while these guides had summit rates of 0%, they also had no deaths. It was not that by 1996 Everest was a disaster waiting to happen. It was that by 1996 Rob Hall was a disaster waiting to happen. Having his past expeditions saved from disaster by Guy Cotter and Ed Beesters, without these stronger and more cautious guides present, it was just a matter of time before Hall's repeatedly poor decisions would lead to a disaster. Looking briefly at 1992, where Rob Hall and Gary Ball found themselves in dire straits, this time high on K2. Although the 1992 K2 expedition has been subject to some revisionist history, as many of the people involved are long dead, including Scott Fisher, Rob Hall, Gary Ball, we have Ed Beester's diary entry where he notes that he, quote, saved 2 people, referring to Rob Hall and Gary Ball, as this is being written about the events of his final summit push. We also have a 1992 article written about Scott Fisher's involvement, noting that Fisher said he rescued 3 people in total on the expedition. These would have been Chantal Modee, Rob Hall, and Gary Ball. In histories written decades after the event, Rob Hall's condition is largely glossed over, and the rescue is seemingly confined to just that of Gary Ball. While it is clear that Ball was in the worst condition of the two, it is also clear that both Ed Beesters and Scott Fisher claim to have rescued both Rob Hall and Gary Ball in the immediate aftermath of the events. Rob Hall did get better as they descended, so some of it is just the confusion that relates to exactly when Rob Hall was in distress himself and when he got better after he had slept at a lower camp. Disaster nearly struck again in 1995 on Everest, with Hall once more in charge. Arriving with only 300 meters of rope to fix the essential sections between South Col and the summit, adventure consultants devised a plan in which Hall, Cotter, and Viesturs would take turns fixing the 300-meter rope segment. The clients would then climb up the 300-meter section, and one of the guides in the rear would take the rope up, carry it to the front, and lead out the next 300 meters of fixing the rope, reusing the same rope over and over again. Predictably, this plan collapsed almost immediately. Instead, Cotters and Viesturs chose the only practical solution: short rope their clients up the mountain. This was the speed of safety short roping, but using actual rope lengths far longer than the 3-foot tether Lopsong used on Sandy Pittman in 1996. Guy Cotter short roped Doug Hansen and took the initial lead, but would alternate with Viesturs. This 1995 short roping of the mountain was highly effective. Adventure consultants reached the balcony in just 5 hours in 1995, compared to about 7 hours in 1996, despite similar client profiles. Lopsong Jangbu was part of that same adventure consultants team in 1995. You witnessed firsthand how Cotter and Viesturs used short roping not as a crutch, but as a legitimate technique to speed clients up terrain where there was no fixed ropes. Given that Lopsong observed elite Western guides, Cotters and Viesturs, successfully short roping clients to maintain pace and safety, it is entirely plausible that he viewed this practice as not only normal, but expected with adventure consultants or mountain madness style of guiding. Thus, when he short roped Sandy Pittman in 1996, he almost certainly was drawing on what he had seen the previous season. As a note, Chantal Maudit was not short roped on the ascent, but was short roped on the descent. Doug Hansen, however, was short roped both up and down. Cotter's detailed account allows us to reconstruct that Hansen consumed 4¼ bottles of oxygen during the climb, repeatedly running out and being resupplied. He spent extended periods at 4 liters per minute and still barely made it back from his high point at South Summit. Despite Doug Hansen being short roped both up and down the mountain, running out of oxygen numerous times, and using over 4 bottles just to get to the high point of South Summit, Rob Hall thought it was a great idea to invite the then 45-year-old Hansen back to try again in 1996. Of course, in 1996, Hansen was performing equally poorly and made the decision to turn around early, and had already started heading back to South Col when Rob Hall not only stopped him from returning, but then left Hansen alone to make the final climb from South Summit to the summit without any Sherpa nor guides to assist him. Yes, there was a storm. But Hansen had fallen apart in 1995 when there was no storm, and it is unlikely that he would have survived in 1996 even if no storm had existed. Turning to the fall of 1988 Everest season, when Hall and Ball requested a permit for Everest, the Nepalese government rejected the application. While we do not know exactly why it was rejected, the likely reason was that absolutely no one on the expedition had ever led a successful 8,000-meter summit, and only one person, Lydia Bradey, had ever stood on the summit of an 8,000-meter peak. Rather than taking the rejection as perfectly valid assessment that inexperienced 8,000-meter climbers should not take on Everest as their very first 8,000-meter leadership role, Hall and Ball came up with a scheme to attach themselves to the Czechoslovakian permit so that on paper they would be subject to their supervision, but in reality they would break off, and Rob Hall could finally bag an 8,000-meter peak and get the other members to the top. At least, that was the theory. Unfortunately, Rob Hall did not reach the summit in 1988, nor did he in 1989, though he did not have any clients in 1989. 1990, much like Sandy Pittman would do in 1996, Rob Hall reached the summit of Everest on his 3rd attempt. Nor was Rob Hall the only inexperienced guide on the mountain in 1988. On the north side, a massive American team, dubbed the Cowboys of Everest, had 32 climbers, but absolutely no Sherpa. However, that expedition was more of a tourist expedition, and none of the members attempted the summit, and all returned safely. Of the 32 climbers, not a single one ventured into the death zone. Thus, reports of crowds or the massively unqualified climbers can be misleading if those climbers were all smart enough to turn around well before they got into any trouble. On the south side was another large American team led by Jim Frush, which consisted of 12 Americans, 1 British climber, and 4 high-altitude Sherpa. Unlike Rob Hall, Frush had actually been to Everest before as a client and had led the successful summit of the Cowboys of Choyao expedition in 1986. Frush's expedition would go on to put Stacey Allison, the first American woman, on the summit. Allison had attempted Everest the previous year as part of the American Everest North Face expedition, Here, North Face refers to the side of the mountain, and not that it was sponsored by the North Face clothing company. There, she, Scott Fisher, and 2 other members of their team were hit by a blizzard while climbing in the white limbo section of the North Face and had to make their retreat. In 1988, Allison was back, and this time reached the summit. Scott Fisher had been rejected for the 1988 expedition, but was trekking in the region and met Allison base camp. The following is from American Alpine Journal by Stacey Allison and Jeffrey Tabin. A very brief word on the expedition, and a note on human values. Then I want to describe how they worked well with the other teams establishing the route, and it picks up. It should be emphasized that our members, Steve Russo and John Petrosky, gave up a summit attempt to aid in the rescue of the Spanish team. On October 14th, Sergio Martinez fell altitude sick on the south summit. His Spanish companions gave him all their remaining oxygen, and with their Sherpa companions went on to the summit. On their return, they found him in critical condition, blind, and in and out of consciousness. They rigged a kind of rope basket and dragged him to South Col, where they asked for and got permission to use oxygen we had stored there. The next morning, they began to drag him lower. Meanwhile, Ross and Petrosky were climbing toward the South Col on a summit attempt. When they met Ross, a physician, examined Martinez and felt he had little chance of survival. Nevertheless, the pair immediately helped in the rescue, as did the members of all the teams. Martinez was brought down to Camp 2. An experimental pressure bag was used with considerable success. Ross and Petrosky nursed him for 48 sleepless hours. Finally, 20 climbers from all teams carried him down to base camp for a helicopter rescue. The respect of our 2 members for human life is one that we can all learn from. Of the 13 Western climbers and 28 Sherpa on Fresh's team, there were no deaths, and a total of 7 reached the summit. I will note that there were 4 deaths on the Czechoslovakian team, and this was hard on Lydia Bradey, as she had climbed with them. In addition, while they did not witness her summit, they could have stood up for her climbing ability and acclimatization. Also on the mountain in 1988 were 4 first-time Everest climbers, Rob Hall and Gary Ball, as leaders of their own expedition, with Bill Atkinson's and Lydia Bradey along as climbers. The following is from the Himalayan database, and it sums up the basics of the expedition. This party were officially members of the Czechoslovak team to the southwest face, but they were actually a separate group. They went up Lotsi's west face to acclimatize, then Ball, Hall, and Atkinson ascended the south pillar, with Ball gaining a high point of 8,100 meters on the 12th of October. The woman member, Lydia Bradey, did not attempt the pillar, went up only the Lotsi face, reaching the South Col, was seen at the south summit, and said she got to the summit by herself on the 14th. Her claim was disputed by others, including the New Zealanders, who even issued a statement saying she could not have done so, but a Spaniard who summited on the same day, as she says she did, believes her detailed account. She was the first woman to scale Everest without bottled oxygen. Now, there are disputes about exactly what route Rob Hall actually climbed. Hall himself denied having followed the South Pillar route. Lydia Bradey covers all of that in her book, Going Up is Easy, but more importantly is that after the expedition, Rob Hall and Gary Ball spoke out against Lydia Bradey's summit. There are endless theories as to why Rob Hall and Gary Ball did so. Bradey notes the following. I've known Rob many years, since we were teenagers. Before K2 and Everest, I had more high-altitude Himalayan experience than him, and there was a time when it was clear he wanted us to hook up and become this amazing, awesome team. Did you ever hook up, though? No, but it didn't matter, because we got on okay most of the time. I respected his drive and his management skills. Others speculate that Rob Hall didn't want to get in trouble with the Nepalese government, because Rob Hall was not a designated leader of any official expedition, and Bradey was not permitted to climb the Southeast Ridge route. As for analyzing Lydia Bradey's climb, I will note I did correspond with Miss Bradey. However, just as with survivors of the 1996 disaster that I've corresponded with, although the interaction was positive, people's memories do not improve as time goes on. She does not claim to remember the details, but was able to clear up a few minor points. For instance, she did not collect summit rocks, and she did not remember seeing any rock outcroppings. This is similar to the recent drone photos showing those rock areas covered by snow in the fall of 2025. As other expeditions reported high snow in 1988, this is consistent with her memory. The notion that interviewing someone 30-plus years after an event and somehow getting the true version of the facts is ridiculous. Miss Bradey did not claim to have such memory, but did confirm that the statements made in her book were accurate, though she was a little fuzzy about one of the locations, perhaps thinking it was a little closer to South Summit than the location described in her book. I do not assign any weight to a person having a fuzzy memory 30-plus years after an event. So let's get started with a basic analysis of her climb. She left South Col at 2 a.m. There were no fixed ropes above South Col, with the exception of the Hillary Step. She proceeded across the ice field and encountered the Italian team camp, which was just below the incline, much closer to the slope than where modern expeditions put their camps. The Italians then started out in front of her as they were using oxygen. Shortly before dawn, she was just below the balcony and noticed that her water was completely frozen. Thus, she had no water for her climb, and this highlights a major difference between modern expeditions that use plastic bottles and the 1924 expedition, which used vacuum thermoses that would keep the water warm for the duration of any legitimate summit push. A little while later, she took her camera out to take some pictures, but it was frozen. I discussed this with her, and it was determined that she was using an electric model of a compact Olympus camera. The manual for that model indicates that the batteries would not operate in the cold, another major advantage of the 1924 manually operated cameras. She had attached the camera to a tripod, so she could not simply put it into her down suit, nor was she aware at the time that the problem was the frozen batteries. At approximately 2:30, she was on South Summit, as supported by the radio call logs. This gives a climb time of 12 hours and 30 minutes to that location. It should be noted that this is approximately the same climb time for the bulk of the Mountain Madness climbers in 1996. That is, Lena Gammelgard, Sandy Pittman, Tim Madsen, Charlotte Fox, all of whom it took approximately 12 hours to reach the South Summit, though they were using oxygen. The next corroborated time is 8:30 above the Italian camp, which would be about 200 meters across the ice shelf from her own tent. Thus, the issue is what happened during the intervening 6 hours. Did she reach the summit? We can start with some statistical analysis of people who climb the Southeast Ridge Route without oxygen. A total of 115 people have climbed above South Summit without using oxygen along that route. Of those, 19 turned around, while 96 went on to summit. Of course, this does not prove that Lydia Bradey reached the summit, but it does dispel any notion that it would be improbable or that the odds were stacked against her. Other climbers on that same route climbing without oxygen who push on above South Summit overwhelmingly reach the summit. Turning to her climb times, she reported she was on the summit at approximately 5:30, which would be a 2-hour climb from South Summit to the summit. Again, approximately the same time that the bulk of the Mountain Madness team took to reach the summit in 1996, so this does not entail any superhuman feats of mountaineering. She then reports being slightly above the start of the incline above South Col at 8:30 p.m. for a descent time of just 3 hours. To compare with 1996, Anatoly Bukrev descended from the Hillary Step at about 2:45 p.m., and other than a brief delay when he was slowed down by this inexperienced high-altitude climber who had run out of oxygen and was slowing other climbers down that were trying to pass him, Bukrev had a clear run down to South Col, which he reached just after 5 p.m. for a roughly 2-hour and 30-minute descent from the Hillary Step all the way to South Col. Thus, Bradey's descent would have been slightly slower than that of Bukrev's in 1996 and far slower than that of Peter Hobler, the first person to reach the summit without supplemental oxygen in 1978. Hobler's climbing partner, Reinhold Messner, was shortly behind him. Hobler descended from the summit to South Col in just 1 hour, and Messner in just 1 hour, 30 minutes. In general, people who climb without oxygen descend very quickly. Bradey's climb and ascent time shows she is nowhere near the times of Messner, Hobler, or even Bukrev. However, her times do not require that she be anything other than a strong, fit climber. Her times were good, but well within the bounds of feasibility. Her ascent time below South Summit was 216 vertical feet per hour, and her ascent time above South Summit was 180 vertical feet per hour. Thus, contrary to some pseudo-analysis that was performed, Bradey did not claim to have gotten faster above South Summit. Instead, her climb times follow a normal slowing as she climbed higher. Bradey was seen crawling across a cornice section of an area that is aptly called the Cornice Traverse, and this area can be extremely problematic depending on the snow conditions. In 1995, also under heavy snow conditions similar to those of Bradey, Guy Cotter reported that at that exact same location of the traverse, it avalanched down just after he had passed it, and he would have been taken with it if he had not just moved a few feet to his left. The fact that Bradey was being cautious at that point does not mean she didn't reach the summit. On the other hand, for critics that point out she was seen on her hands and knees, they offer no explanation as to how she managed to recover and make it down the mountain on her own. People who are indeed reduced to only being able to crawl have generally not been able to get up and start walking on their own without being provided oxygen, dexamethasone, or substantial assistance from other climbers. This is especially true where she was seen on the col between the South Summit and the actual summit. For her to return to camp from that point, at the very least, she needed to climb the the roughly 30 vertical feet back to the top of South Summit so she could begin her descent. This is essentially what trapped Rob Hall in that location in 1996. He had to climb up before he could go back down. As Bradey had no oxygen and no one came to assist her, when analyzing her climb, I am faced with a choice between an extremely improbable recovery entirely on her own compared to the far more realistic explanation that she was being extremely cautious over a knowingly problematic traverse, but was still perfectly capable of walking. Of those two, I choose the far more plausible version. In addition, Bradey was well acclimatized from her earlier trip to K2. She left K2 in August and was on Everest in September, so she would have been well acclimatized. The largest problem with Bradey's account is that there are two different versions, the version she told the Nepalese government and the version she told everyone else. For this, I want to take a little diversion to look at Guy Cotter. Now, I do not know Guy Cotter, nor have I ever met him, but I will be looking at his 2023 book, Everest Mountain Guide, The Remarkable Story of a Kiwi Mountaineer. I'll assign that book as homework because it provides key insights into the 1996 disaster. Cotter went on to take over as CEO of Venture Consultants after Rob Hall's death. During the 1996 season, he was climbing on Pomori and has firsthand experience of the radio calls that were made as he made notes as they came in. Although there are also tapes from Adventure Consultants base camps, Cotter's position on Pomori allowed him to hear additional items that might not have been picked up at base camp. I won't steal any of Cotter's thunder, but numerous additional details are in his book, and if you thought any portion of the popular account of the 1996 disaster was not entirely fiction, Guy Cotter's account of the radio calls and the information he received from Stuart Hutchinson further debunks the popular account. And while Guy Cotter completely debunks many of the fictional accounts of the 1996 disaster, what I want to talk about here is his ignoring the 1995 incident in Tibet. Cotter's book is an autobiography of his life as a climber and guide. It proceeds chronologically through the decades he spent climbing. However, although the spring 1995 season is covered in extreme detail, the 1995 fall season is omitted completely from his book. This is odd because this is an entry from the Himalayan database about Cotter's 1995 fall expedition. Guy Cotter sent a fax from Lhasa Hotel about bomb explosion and seen army vehicles speeding down street, was arrested on 5th September, and deported to Kathmandu on 9th. Was intensely interrogated and forced to confess he had committed a crime. All this was videotaped, as was his deportation. So it is interesting that Cotter is willing to provide extensive details about the 1996 disaster, which embarrassed a popular author, but he is unwilling to even speak about an incident that would offend Chairman Mao. This is relevant to Lydia Bradey's story because climbers routinely change their story to match what governments that control access to mountains want them to say. Bradey did not want a 10-year ban from climbing in Nepal, so she said what she had to say. Cotter doesn't want Adventure Consultants banned from climbing in China, so he left out a rather significant event from his book. This is just the world we live in. As a final note, in his book, Cotter confirms that he accepts Lydia Bradey's summit. In contrast, Ed Viesturs, in No Shortcuts to the Top, asserts that in 1995, no female had reached the summit without oxygen, thus disputing Bradey's claim without directly saying so. I will also note that Cotter also mentions Lydia Bradey 10 times in his book, including confirming her 1988 oxygen-less summit. In contrast, Bradey was not mentioned once in Viesturs' The Mountain, nor in No Shortcuts to the Top. While I do respect Ed Viesturs and routinely use his work in this channel as a reference, I feel it is extremely unfair for a major writer about Everest climbing and its history to ignore a major dispute about a summit. In contrast, Viesturs mentions George Mallory 156 times in The Mountain. This is odd, because Viesturs claims his position on Mallory is the following. Time and again over the years, people have asked me whether I think Mallory and Irvin made it to the summit on June 8, 1924. The answer I give shocks most of them, but it's firmly rooted in the philosophy that I've adhered to throughout my mountaineering career. My answer is this. It doesn't matter whether Mallory and Irvin got to the summit. It's irrelevant. They didn't make it back down. Well, Lydia Bradey did make it back down, and she at least deserves the courtesy of having Everest writers address her claim about whether she reached the summit.